This is part 2 of the lecture on Georg Simmel. There are a number of things that we should return to before getting back into the meat of his writing and theorizing. I want to make a few more comments about his career, which was quite unusual in that he spent it attempting to get into academia in Germany, but there was great prejudice not only against him on the basis of his Jewish background, although that background is something that needs further exploration because his father was a Catholic and his mother was a Protestant. I'm not aware of how much in his own life his Jewish background actually meant to him. I've never read a biography of Simmel, and I'm not aware of that aspect of his life. But he also had tremendous difficulty in getting an academic position because the discipline of sociology was just starting out and there were fairly few positions available, for one. And for two, the kinds of subject matter he studied was not really mainstream. He was not a political economist. He did take on certain economic concepts and tried to further elaborate upon them. And like all social thinkers of his day, he was operating in the shadow of Marx. There was some necessity to respond to Marx, but he did not have a defined research agenda. He picked up the things that he found interesting. As we mentioned in the earlier lecture, he talked about fashion, he talked about money, the stranger. He wanted to explore forms that would tie together the kinds of social interaction that people engaged in across all kinds of contents. So in the book Conflict, as we noted, he could explore conflict and competition within a business enterprise as easily as he could within the family or within a political setting. So what he was trying to get at was that there were certain things that tied sociological phenomena together, and they could be found by exploring them on the level of their form. We're going to be getting into some more of his forms in a moment. I also want to make a few other comments about his wife, Gertrude Simmel, who was a philosopher and writer in her own right. This was an aspect of many of the lives of the wives of men in sociology. We see it in Weber's case, where Marianne Weber becomes an important influence on the direction that his work took by virtue of her organizing it after he died. Gertrude Simmel had an independent career. She was known as a writer, but in discussing Simmel, until fairly recently, she did not appear as an important figure. Next, we're going to be taking up Charlotte Perkins Gilman for our next theorist, and that will definitely bring us into direct confrontation with feminist ideas and the dilemma that women found themselves in the 19th century and for many thousands of years before that. It is only in fairly recent time that women have been able to gain a certain emancipation, and this will be the subject of many of the theories of the sociologists that we study. I should stop and take that back to a degree, because sociology, if you look at the list of theorists in our text alone, it is overweighted with white males. There are a few that are not white, but they're almost all males. There are only two other female theorists on the list out of quite a number, out of about 20. So this speaks, I think, volumes about the nature of social theory and the imaginative base from which it flows. Another theorist we'll be discussing is Harriet Martineau. She appears in the Gilman chapter. Harriet Martineau was an early 19th century sociologist who again has only been given attention over the last, I would say, 30 or 40 years. So it's something important to reflect upon and give these important women their due and demonstrate that women have also had a profound influence on the direction of sociology. We'll take this up as we go through other chapters. Now, getting back to Simmel and his writing, his formal interests, your text does not give you an introduction to everything he wrote. Of course, your text can't give you an introduction to everything any of the theorists wrote, because some of them wrote shelves of books, and it's very hard to boil down the work of somebody like, say, Durkheim or Weber into a few pages and then give you a selection to get acquainted with how they write. One of the problems of taking up sociological or really any kind of theory is that after a while the commentators become more visible than the theorists themselves. So not only are you faced with having to plunge through the sometimes fairly difficult writing style of the theorist, you're also left with having to plunge through the commentators who try to make them plainer to you and explain them to you, so you get them at second hand. Reading Simmel, I think that there are many places where we can stop and criticize for a number of reasons. Of all the theorists we've had so far, he seems to me to be the most general. You can read paragraph after paragraph of his writing and not read anything that pins it down to a particular reality. It's like a list. It's like a very long list of one generality folding over into another. As a qualitative sociologist, I understand the value of analyzing social phenomena from the qualitative perspective without becoming mired in statistical analysis. But even saying that, Simmel seems to go quite a distance in making statements without really anything to back them up. You can almost find this on any page. And then when you try to take what he says seriously and analyze it and put it into a context in your mind, you find that maybe it doesn't work so well. I'll be pointing this out to you as we go along. His value, I think, is in pointing us to consider certain phenomena that sociologists would not otherwise look at. His paper on the adventure, I think, is really fascinating. And when I pose this to my class, I ask them at first, I begin with the question, first of all, what is an adventure? And second of all, how do you know when you're having one? These are kinds of considerations that Simmel makes us look at. An adventure is a kind of extraordinary experience that very often you don't know when you're having it. And only afterward, maybe you went through it with a friend, you turn to them and you say, oh my God, that was really something. What an adventure. And when does it begin and when does it end? It really becomes a matter of the narration. It becomes a narrative where you demark reality at the points you think the excitement started and where it ended, where the adventure began and when it was over. There may be some preliminary consideration of what led up to it, and at the end of it, you usually describe how you felt when it was over. But it's a hard thing to get your mind around because it doesn't announce itself. You really create it after the fact. So his paper on the adventure, I think, is one of those that shows us we can find interesting sociological phenomena and analysis in all kinds of human experience. Now, the three papers we have left to discover, the three selections, one comes from the philosophy of money, the other is The Stranger, and last is The Metropolis and Mental Life. Let's begin in the order that the text gives them to us, and we'll start with money. Simmel, in a way, does something what Marx does in attempting to get us to focus on the nature of value. What is value and how does it arise? There is a very famous Marxist aphorism where he says, in our day, people know the price of everything and the value of nothing. And this, for me, is a kind of profound insight into the way people calculate what is going on around them and the value of things that are in the human landscape. But Simmel takes quite a different perspective than Marx. I would call it a fairly sentimental perspective, and in another way I would call it a fairly alarming perspective, because he does not take, as Marx does, the basis of value in human labor. For Marx, it's a fairly concise and clear connection between what something is worth and its value. It has to do with the amount of labor that is put into it. But Simmel sees this as a much more subjective matter, and it comes out of his basic understanding of human interaction as exchange. This presages, if you look ahead in your text, we have an entire school of thought called exchange theory. We're going to get to it in not too many weeks. And exchange theory starts out from its very basis in saying that human interaction is exchange, that people calculate, that a friendship will remain in existence, for instance, only as long as both parties get out of it what they think it is worthwhile to keep putting into it. So everything becomes a kind of monetary calculation for exchange theory. Simmel says something similar, but he goes further than this in talking about the nature of value. And what is it that he says? Well, he makes this connection between sacrifice and value. And I find this a little bit sentimental, in the sense that what is somebody willing to sacrifice to get a particular thing? And that is the value for them. But of course, that is not the way exchange actually works, because there may be, at some point in putting a price on something, the calculation of the person putting that price on the thing, that they can get a certain price because people will be willing, given what the thing is, to make the sacrifice. But if they ask too much, whether or not someone might be willing to make a sacrifice does not tell us whether they are capable of making the sacrifice. The two things are quite separate. It's almost as if anyone who is willing to make the sacrifice can get the thing. But that is not the case. It's quite clear that there are many things we would sacrifice quite a bit for, but even were we to do so, it would still leave us short. So I find this concept of sacrifice a little bit unsatisfying. There's another aspect to this, which maybe it struck you, but it certainly struck me. If you look on page 257, I'm going to read to you what Simmel says, and let's take it apart. He says, thus, if someone at the point of death from hunger gives away a jewel for a piece of bread, he does so because the latter is worth more to him under the circumstances than the former. Some particular circumstances, however, are always involved when one attaches a feeling of value to an object. Every such feeling of value is lodged in a whole complex system of our feelings, which is in constant flux, adaptation, and reconstruction. Whether these circumstances are exceptional or relatively constant is obviously in principle immaterial. Through the fact that the starving man gives away his jewel, he shows unambiguously that the bread is worth more to him. Well, this is a chilling example, because what he paints for us is a kind of blackmail, where an individual is put under threat of death. Either they give the jewel, or they don't get the bread, and they die. Because he says at the beginning, thus is someone at the point of death from hunger, gives away a jewel. But what Simmel may have tripped upon, and I think this is why this set of sentences is important, is again the logic of capitalism. Because that's exactly the position the capitalist wants to be able to put those they are exchanging with. They want people to be forced into making such a sacrifice and have a need to do so. But this is the very thing that Marx finds to be condemned in capitalism to begin with. It proceeds with the logic of blackmail and murder. This is how I would characterize it. And I don't find any kind of self-consciousness on Simmel's part for saying this. He repeats this again on page 260 when he talks about value and price. He says, if in the poem of Camiso, the highwayman, with pistol drawn, compels the victim to sell his watch and ring for 3 coppers, the fact is that under the circumstances, since the victim could not otherwise save his life, the thing obtained in exchange is actually worth the price. I find this appalling. There is this, again, logic of a crime being committed, of someone's back against the wall. It actually reminds me of the way that healthcare is organized in the United States. Your life, in fact, is threatened, and you have no other choice. So what do? You sell your house. You go into bankruptcy. 500,000 people are put into this situation in the United States every year. I don't think that this is anything that capitalism or the American economic system should congratulate itself about, nor do I think is it a measure of value. What Simmel does seem to do, and this you can find on page 258, is work out a kind of psychology of commodity fetishism. He seems to have put his finger on how this operates. And if you remember what commodity fetishism was, this is the setting out of things in capitalist society in such a way as to make them super desirable and super possessible. People want them. They want them just to have them. He says, in human relationships, most frequently and clearly in erotic relations, we notice how reserve, indifference, or rejection inflames the most passionate desire to prevail over these obstacles and spurs us to efforts and sacrifices which, without these obstacles, would surely seem to us excessive. For many people, the aesthetic gain from climbing the high Alps would not be considered worth further notice if it did not demand the price of extraordinary exertion and dangers, and thereby acquire character, appeal, and consecration. And yes, there is something to this, because those who market goods in a capitalist society want the thrill and the need built into the product so people will buy them. Attaining the thing will be something like climbing an Alp, especially the more expensive the thing is. So I think Simmel may be onto something there, at least from what I can tell. But this is the way he is approaching how money is operating. His book is quite long. The Philosophy of Money is not a short book, and you're only getting a few pages to judge the entire book by. I have not read The Philosophy of Money from cover to cover. I have read The Protestant Ethic and all of Durkheim's works. I find Simmel not that easy to read for a number of reasons, although Conflict and the Web of Group Affiliations are very accessible, and those are worthwhile reading. The Philosophy of Money, I think, requires some prior preparation, and I wouldn't try reading it myself unless I would read a commentary before. Now, as far as The Stranger is concerned, we've already spoken about this to a degree, and your text introduces it in an interesting fashion because it ties it to Simmel's own ethnic background, the Jew as the stranger in Europe. And Simmel does describe the stranger in such a way in his prose that does make us think of this figure of the Jew. And what was it about the Jew that made this figure such a stranger? Well, for one thing, the Jew was ghettoized, and we talked about that very early in the class, so that the little mixing went on in Western Europe, certainly in the last 1,000 years, up until fairly recent times. And there was another problem that Jews had, beside being forced to live in certain areas of a city, is that their occupational possibilities were severely limited. They weren't allowed to farm or own land. That was something that was stripped from Jews from earliest times, probably just after the Roman Empire collapsed and possibly even before. And in the Middle Ages, they were limited to rag merchants and money lending for the most part. Money lending because in the Bible, usury, putting money out at interest, was forbidden. So the Catholic Church forbade Christians to engage in it, and the only ones left to do it were the Jews. And the Jews were forbidden by biblical injunction from doing it, but there was something in it that allowed Jews to do it if Jews weren't involved in the transaction. In other words, if you were lending to non-Jews. As far as I understand, that's how they rationalized becoming money lenders and lending out at interest. But you can see that from early times, this might not have seemed such a strategic position to be in. They simply had the problem of fending off all kinds of highwaymen and anti-Semites who might try to despoil them of whatever they were able to hold together. But as time went on and money became more important, what happened was that this disability that they had been put under turned into a kind of positive, a benefit, because money was the center of all economic activity once the Industrial Revolution took off, and even before. You needed money to finance all the discoveries of the New World. You had to have money financing ships, underwriting the insurance that made it possible for people to invest in them. You didn't want to put money into voyages that could end in disaster without some kind of insurance, and that came along in the 18th century. So slowly but surely, this position as money lender to the world, to the European world, brought Jews into a very strategic position by the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. But people who lend, of course, are always looking to be paid back. So it also created a great deal of animosity toward them from people who had borrowed money from them, because they had the capacity to dun them and ask for their money. So this was a really terrible position for a people that already started out receiving unfriendly glances from the culture in which they lived. Simmel seems to take us through a psychological analysis of what that stranger meant within a society that needed that stranger. So he makes the difference between the stranger and the outcast. Now, what does this mean, an outcast? I'm not exactly sure I agree with Simmel's point when he says that the outcast remains remote, but that the stranger is both near and remote at the same time. I think the outcast is cast out because they could be too near and they can't be remote enough. So the difference between the outcast and the stranger is one of a very thin margin, I would suggest. But in any case, let's look at one of the things that Simmel says about the stranger. He says, in the whole history of economic activity, the stranger makes his appearance everywhere as a trader, Trader, and the trader makes his as a stranger. As long as production for one's own needs is the general rule, or products are exchanged within a relatively small circle, there is no need for a middleman within the group. A trader is required only for goods produced outside the group. Unless there are people who wander out into foreign lands to buy these necessities, in which case they are themselves strange merchants in this other region, the trader must be a stranger. There is no opportunity for anyone else to make a living at it. Meaning that if you're going to trade goods that are not available in the locality in which they are bought, if they're not made there, you've got to go outside that locality to get them. And if you're going to do that for a living, you're actually becoming a kind of permanent stranger. There doesn't seem to me any reason why someone, say from a medieval German city, could not become a trader in these terms and decide to travel abroad and bring things back. I'm really not sure why that would be the case, but I think it would be very easy for a people who was used to this kind of work to continue doing it, and it would be harder for somebody who was from a people that did not do this. Language would be an issue, and being bilingual or trilingual so that you can communicate with the people that you're going to get the goods from and the people you're coming back to sell them to. So there would be all of this involved. But he's right to point out the economic relationship that seems to obtain between the stranger and those they are amid. Now let's move to the Metropolis and Mental Life, which is one of his most famous works, and it's a fascinating analysis of the differences between the metropolis, the large city, and the small rural community. Again, he says many things which I think are problematic. Let's take a look at some of them. On the very first page, on 269, he makes this distinction. He says, thereby, the essentially intellectualistic character of the mental life of the metropolis becomes intelligible as over against that of the small town, which rests more on feelings and emotional relationships. Should we accept this characterization between the city and the rural community, the small town? First of all, what do we mean when we say metropolis? What is the size, the dimension of a place before it can be called that? The population of Berlin, when he wrote this in 1903, was about 2 million people. London already had far exceeded that, and in a few short years, New York would have 8 million people. So when you compare London, New York, and Berlin, Berlin is almost a small town. It seems rather obvious, of course, that the opportunities to avail oneself of educational opportunities in a city would be greater. You would have greater access to people who have the capacity to speak on an intellectual level. That may be true. Who have had life experiences that may be more enriched in one way or another, broader experiences than people who live in small towns. But should we simply write off what people in small towns have been able to accumulate, simply by virtue of the fact that they don't live in a big city? I think of Springfield. Is Springfield a small town? Or does it qualify as a big city? I remember there was a student I had once from Neosho. I didn't know really where that was. We got to talking about it, and they told me that Springfield was the biggest place they'd ever lived. Well, I told them that Springfield was the smallest place that I'd ever lived. But I'm still left feeling that Springfield has a certain level of metropolitan feeling, sensibility. You may not run into it as often in Neosho, but every place where humans congregate, where they have a street with the businesses and commerce and trade and activity, certain of the phenomena that Simmel talks about will also exist. So I'm not simply willing to concede to him this point, although it seems rather logical that when he talks about the blasé attitude of the city dweller, you have so many experiences in one day, you are exposed to so many stimuli that your attitude toward life must be affected. There are certain internal strategies will be relied upon in order to deal with the huge influx of stimulation, of experience, of contact, people flowing by you all the time, until you finally are immune to a degree from the sensation of novelty. Because novelty becomes every day. Novelty is something you take for granted. Whereas in a small town it would not be the same. Something novel, something unusual would make an impression. Whereas the same phenomenon happening in a big city might not make a very big impression at all. Simmel works into this analysis of the city, his analysis of money as well. If you look on page 271, he says, to the extent that money, with its colorlessness and its indifferent quality, can become a common denominator of all values, it becomes the frightful leveler. It hollows out the core of things, their peculiarities, their specific values and their uniqueness and incomparability, in a way which is beyond repair. They all float with the same specific gravity in the constantly moving stream of money. They all rest on the same level and are distinguished only by their amounts. Well, I suppose this is the case. Should we be alarmed that money is the frightful leveler, the common denominator of all values? It has, of course, a utilitarian aspect to it that can't be avoided. How would pragmatic exchange be conducted without the use of money? But in a way, Simmel is doing exactly what Marx does, pointing to money as having an effect above and beyond what the utilitarian purpose it was created for. It is like language, as I mentioned in this respect, because it takes on a life of its own. He says something similar on page 270, where he says, money is concerned only with what is common to all, that is, with the exchange value, which reduces all quality and individuality to a purely quantitative level. All emotional relationships between persons rest on their individuality. whereas intellectual relationships deal with persons as with numbers, that is, as with elements which in themselves are indifferent, but which are of interest only insofar as they offer something objectively perceivable. Now I'm a little confused. Objectively perceivable rather than subjectively perceivable? We get into the issue, the complaint that he makes constantly. This complaint between individual culture and objective culture. He does it not only in the Metropolis and Mental Life, but in other of his writings. And this mirrors, again, this complaint that Weber engaged in when he spoke of disenchantment of the world. On page 275, Simmel says, "The atrophy of individual culture through the hypertrophy of objective culture lies at the root of the bitter hatred which the preachers of the most extreme individualism in the footsteps of Nietzsche directed against the metropolis. But it is also the explanation of why, indeed, they are so passionately loved in the metropolis, and indeed appeared to its residents as the saviors of their unsatisfied yearnings." Simmel uses this distinction he makes between individual culture and objective culture to understand how things have changed over time, especially when you have the impact of the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. This is what he says: "When both of these forms of individualism, which are nourished by the quantitative relationships of the metropolis, that is, individual independence and the elaboration of personal peculiarities, are examined with reference to the historical position, the metropolis attains an entirely new value and meaning in the world history of the spirit. The 18th century found the individual in the grip of powerful bonds which had become meaningless, bonds of a political, agrarian, guild, and religious nature, delimitations which imposed upon the human being at the same time an unnatural form, and for a long time an unjust inequality. In this situation arose the cry for freedom and equality, the belief in the full freedom of movement of the individual in all his social and intellectual relationships, which would then permit the same noble essence to emerge equally from all individuals as nature had placed it in them, and as it had been distorted by social life and historical development." If you remember, the very founding of the United States was on the basis that individuals would be free to achieve what their potential could. That was the whole point. People would be freed up from the medieval attachments that had been forced on them in Europe. It was not only in the United States that this was the case. Throughout the Western world, people were slowly forcing their way out of these social bonds that no longer had any meaning for them. But he makes the comment a little later on that alongside of this liberalistic ideal, there grew up in the 19th century from Goethe and the Romantics on the one hand, and from the economic division of labor on the other, the further tendency, namely, that individuals who had been liberated from their historical bonds sought now to distinguish themselves from one another. So things got, according to Simmel, a little bit out of hand, because once individuals had started down this road of individualism, it sort of went too far. He says, "No longer was it the general human quality in every individual, but rather his qualitative uniqueness and irreplaceability that now became the criteria of his value. In the conflict and shifting interpretations of these two ways of defining the position of the individual within the totality is to be found the external as well as the internal history of our time. It is the function of the metropolis to make a place for the conflict and for the attempts at unification of both of these, in the sense that its own peculiar conditions had been revealed to us as the occasion and the stimulus for the development of both. Well, this is a nice happy ending for the metropolis because it gets to play a mediator between the individualistic tendencies that have seemed to have run over their banks and the generalizing principle that human beings need to bring into their social relations in order to relate positively to each other. Otherwise, they become so individual that they find no basis of recognizing the other. Everyone becomes a stranger to everyone else. So this is what Simmel is telling us the metropolis has as a function in mental life. The very word metropolis follows us through the film that I've asked you to watch, the required film, which is called Metropolis. And the other place that we usually find it is in a comic book, because it is the name of the city where supposedly Superman hangs out, in Metropolis. I don't think it's any coincidence that the authors of the Superman comic book series chose that name, because they started to write it in the 1930s. That concept was in common use. It remains in common use because of the comic book, but otherwise, most people do not speak of a city as a metropolis. They just call it a city. We don't say we're going off to the metropolis to shop. It's a word that has very peculiar connotations. But I hope you saw in the required film echoes of the various theorists we have spoken about so far. Depends, of course, when you saw it. If you saw it right away, you'd have to remember back to see if those echoes were there. But I think it is a brilliant film in the way it incorporates so many of the theoretical elements of many of the writers that we have been focusing upon. One set of distinctions that Simmel is noted for is the one between the dyad and the triad. Many people react to this distinction using a standard aphorism, two's company and three's a crowd, the dyad being a group of two and the triad three. But what Simmel does is show us the importance of this difference. So let's just focus on this for a moment. First of all, a dyad is the smallest social group. It seems unlikely that you can count an individual as a social group, although once we get into discussing symbolic interaction and the capacity of the human mind to create conversation within itself, it's almost as if a whole social universe can inhabit a particular individual's self. And I'm not talking somebody who has multiple personalities. I'm just talking about somebody who is perfectly average and thinks in terms of how others might think, which is the hallmark of being social from the symbolic interactionist point of view. You'll find that interactionists took a great deal from Simmel, especially this idea of interaction as event. I think that's very significant. But what is a dyad? You've got two people in a relationship. This is usually an intimate relationship. You can have intimacy in a dyad. There won't be any interruptions. Physical intimacy is certainly possible. Social intimacy is possible in that you can share certain confidences and secrets. Two people can share a secret, although a New Yorker like myself, who's particularly paranoid, does not believe that if you have a secret, revealing it to anyone is really a very positive strategy. But theoretically, secrets are possible in a dyad. The negative aspect of a dyad is that the relationship will end and the group will end if one person leaves. So each person has a kind of veto power on whether there shall be a group in the first place. That's the nature of a dyad. When you involve a third party, when you bring three people together, the dynamics change radically. It can't be quite as intimate. Although God knows that sexual relations are carried on in our day with any number at any place at any time, it still is an inhibiting factor. Three people will often create a kind of social situation in which sexual activity is not in the cards. Two is a group where sexual activity is much more likely to naturally occur. But it can happen among three, although, as I say, it is unlikely. Intimacy among three is also unlikely. One of the things that you can do in a triad that you can't do in a dyad is you can have combinations. So two can gang up on one. Two can create a clique so that two out of the three can create intimacies and share intimacies which they do not let the third party in on. So you've got that dynamic happening. It becomes quite a complex arrangement when you involve three people. Think of the difference when two people go to dinner rather than three people having dinner. Three people having dinner are not going to be talking in hushed tones to each other. Two people will, especially if they develop feelings for each other, which are more likely to happen without the presence of a third party. So Simmel lays out some really interesting dimensions of the dyad and the triad. But of course that was what he was known for. Well, I hope that made Simmel somewhat more available to you. We now move on to Charlotte Perkins Gilman in our next chapter, which is chapter 5. This is the end of part 2, Georg Simmel.